Thank you very much. As being the only host or coming from EUI at this panel, I would like to wish you warm welcome again, and I hope you will enjoy these 2 days and we will have a fruitful and productive discussion at this panel and in general this conference. As Paolo said, my paper deals with economic voting in Western Balkan countries on aggregate level or measuring the influence or the role of the macroeconomic parameters in incumbents' vote share. The structure of my presentation is that at the beginning I will talk about the theoretical background and theories of economic voting that I would like to that I'm testing at former Yugoslav countries with special aspect of the specifics of the former Yugoslav countries that I think will influence the effect of economic voting in general. Then I will present my research question based on the theory I will present and the hypothesis that will be tested before I present the data and methodology I'm going to use. The empirical findings and discussion of results with possible explanations of the outcome will be discussed before I conclude. So, one of the biggest problems in studying economic voting in Western Balkan countries is that there is a lack of research on country level, lack of comparative research. And most of the theories I based on this research is based on the post-communist countries having in mind the same background. Building on this, one of the most obvious hypothesis testing for economic voting on aggregate level is the responsibility hypothesis, or whether voters reward or punish the government based on the macroeconomic performance, or some of the main parameters in this sense: unemployment rate, inflation, GDP growth, etc. So it is expected that when the economy is doing well, the voters are eager to reward the incumbent parties and to give them another term. And when the economy is not doing so well, they're punishing the government by voting for the opposition. Anyway, this theory and this reward and punishment mechanism is not symmetric. One of the main theories or one of the main mechanisms of this asymmetry, called grievance asymmetry, talks about the fact that voters are more eager to punish the government for bad performance instead of rewarding it when the economy is doing well. And one of the most obvious cases of this grievance asymmetry is the case of unemployment growth test in one of the pioneering research in this area of Miller in the 70s in US case. Having in mind the post-communist legacy and the research done in post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we find controversial results or results that are opposing to each other, from research that claims there is no economic voting as Harper, to one of the most recent research of Roberts, which claims that there is hyper-accountability identified in 10 Central and Eastern European countries, which means that it's not only that voters are punishing the government constantly, but when the economy is doing worse, this punishment is even more severe. So one of these basic postulates of economic voting tested on Central and Eastern Europe, I will also test on aggregate level in former Yugoslav countries. Nevertheless, what is important when testing economic voting or general voting behavior in Yugoslav countries is to take into account the specific context of this period of transition from the 90s and the breakup of Yugoslavia till the most recent developments with the economic crisis. So I believe, and I take into account the historical background and the influence of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the most tragic bloodshed after the Second War with the civil wars, and I think that this, joined with or preceded by the rise of nationalism, which we still face consequences of even lately, together with the strong influence of the international factor in the different forms from the beginning of the 90s with the sanctions for Serbia, and then the peaceful agreements, then the International Court of ICT, EUI cooperation, till the most recent conditionality pressure also influenced the shaping of voting behavior of citizens and the incumbents' vote share. With something important, and that's the political context, in the last 20 years, the same as in most of the post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we noticed electoral volatility and unstable governments, and I think that this would be some of the possible explanations of what I expect as the effect of economy or economic voting in a former Yugoslavian country to be with a limited extent. Based on the grievance asymmetry and based on what is already noticed in most of the post-communist countries about the influence of specific macroeconomic parameters, I also consider that unemployment would be one of the most significant factors that would explain economic voting in former Yugoslav countries, the 7 countries that formed, that were part of Yugoslavia. The third, fourth, and fifth hypotheses are already going deeper in the context of Yugoslavian transition, or the transition of these 7 countries, and based on one of the most influential paper, again tested in US, the Bretton Peace theory of voting. So I also count the influence of the human causalities or the victims of the war, and how this influences incumbents' vote share. The fourth and the fifth hypothesis, so the fourth looks in the party context, and this is based on the research on post-communist countries done by Tucker, who looks in the history of the political parties, or more precisely whether they are old or new regime party, and he hypothesizes that the old regime parties would be hurt more when the economy is not performing well, and I test this hypothesis on former Yugoslav countries' background as well. The last one takes into account the timing based on the hypothesis of Dutch, tested again in post-communist countries, that with time, voters are becoming more aware of the economic parameters, and they are more able to grade, to evaluate the performance of the government based on the economic performance. I combine this with the effect of the global economic and financial crisis, so I split my sample after elections after 2008 and elections before 2008, and I want to test whether there's a difference in the effect. The data I use, so my dependent variable is based on the parties and elections data set, also with the robustness check with the data from the state electoral commission's official results. The economic data is mainly collected by World Bank data set, and the data on war causality is collected by Uppsala and Oslo centers for conflict studies. My dependent variable is the incumbents' vote share, and again, taking into account the former or the context, most of the governments in these 20 years were coalition governments, so the dependent variable is actually the cumulative vote share of parties that were forming the coalition or they were part of the government. This is a bit different from the primary postulates of the responsibility hypothesis tested in US and then in England, where most of the governments are one-party government. This is another obstacle in the case of multi-party system countries. Independent variables, the economic parameters include, as I already said, the GDP, inflation, unemployment change, and something that I think would be important in the case of Western Balkan countries, or former Yugoslav countries, that the consumer price index, which captures the consumer's capacity or the power people to buy products, and something that was part of the agenda of almost all governments, that was attraction of foreign investment. So I will test whether these variables also influence. On political parameters, as I already said, I expect governmental stability. I check for ideology, international pressure. As I said, the international factor was important part of the story in former Yugoslav countries, and I think that might influence. Effective number of parties is also included, and previous vote share as one of the most regular variables when tested. War parameters is the number of the war human causalities, and the method is ordinary least squares. So the results, we have the first model that includes only the economic parameters, and we see that indeed employment is significant and has influence, and consumers' price index, as I said, also is influencing the vote share of incumbent parties. In the second, I think that the model is decently well in prediction of the variance. So 47 only the economic parameters. In the second model, when we already have political variables, we have 72% of explanation of variance. And in the second case, we see again the same unemployment significant and consumer price index, and plus the effective number of parties as a quite strong explanatory variable of vote share. They are not statistically significant, but coefficients, and I think it's worth to be interpreted. That's the governmental ideology and governmental stability. So unstable government really hurts the results, and ideology, left-wing governments were more hurt by results than by voters than right-wing. And I think there is an explanation about this, and I will concentrate later on this. In the last model, I only include the civil war losses to the variables already existing, and we see that they are statistically significant, and we see that voters punish the governments for war causalities. The model, again, it's predicting quite decently. Now, based on the hypothesis of Tucker, tested by Roberts, I split this, I have two subsamples. So with the new regime parties and the old regime parties, we see, and I talk about this, that the subsamples are quite small, and we should not be very enthusiastic about explaining or taking results very strongly, although, for example, the subsamples are almost similar to the subsample of Hibbs within his bread and peace, and also Roberts has almost a similar number of observations. We see that new regime parties, the unemployment influences, and for the old regime, we see stronger influence of the economic parameters, more variables being significant. But nevertheless, in all the cases of before the last one that's the economic crisis, we don't see the effect of hyper-accountability as in the case of post-communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So the effect is smaller, and even political context variables more strongly influence the vote share than than economic variables. In the last case where I split the subsample on after the crisis and before the crisis, as I said, taking into account not only the economic crisis variable, but the effect, but also timing, because it's considered that the time, or as the democracies are advancing, the voters would be more aware of economic performance, and they would evaluate governments on economic performances. Fortunately, results are not strong in this sense, and actually we see that we don't see a strong effect of crisis on economic parameters and in general on vote share. Having this in mind, the results that I presented, economic voting has very limited influence on vote share in countries of former Yugoslavia. Unemployment, completely expected change, and consumers price index, which is an important and interesting variable because captures exactly the personal economic power of voters, and that's it's also a good predictor of economic voter, and this actually says that voters care about their own well-being when decide whether they would vote, like the CPI. That's how I interpret. War causalities influence negatively, and old regime parties are more vulnerable to be held accountable, while economic crisis does not influence on strengthening the influence of economic parameters in explaining vote share. Why is this? Why are these results as they are? Especially the last about the economic crisis, or whether the effects are not so strong as in the other countries. And I see several explanations. That's the still strong effect of nationalism and the context. Even after 2008, all former Yugoslav countries were facing specific circumstances. Kosovo's independence, Montenegro's independence, Macedonians' veto to enter NATO because of the Macedonian-Greek dispute with the name. Bosnia and Herzegovina and constant interethnic problems in that country. And so there are a lot of issues that still are a great basis for rise of nationalism in these countries. The second and strong possible explanation of the outcome is the high percentage of clientelism in these countries. And we observe this phenomenon in almost all the countries, specifically Montenegro, Macedonia, Kosovo, and Serbia as well, and maybe this problem is lower in Slovenia, is what I'm saying. The other perception, the other possible explanation is the perception of the past, and there is already a research conducted by Schieber, Henjak, and there's also Panov and Taleski on Macedonia, where we see that actually the perception of the past and the role of the Communist Party, or in Croatia even further, the position that families were taking during the Second World War is one of the strongest explanatory explanations of voting even after like 60 years of 70 years of the Second World War. And the last possible explanation lies in the high level of corruption and and numerous scandals in these countries that I also think could influence on vote share more than just the macroeconomic parameters that have been tested in general. Thank you very much for your attention. This is my first draft of the paper, and I would be really happy to hear comments. Thank you.